Being mentally unsound as I am leads me to experience the world differently to most people. Now I guess most of us have had the "is my red" the same as your red conversation. That's a conversation about communication and the nature of language, which, while fascinating, is different from psychosis. Psychosis is an abnormal condition of the mind that results in difficulties determining what is real and what is not. Symptoms may include false beliefs, delusions, and seeing or hearing things that others do not see or hear, hallucinations. As I mentioned yesterday, once psychosis starts, and your brain starts lying to you, life becomes exponentially harder and more stressful. Let's take this current episode as an example. Let's explain why things got as bad as they got this time. It's a long and wandering story, so I will skip most of it, and skip to the important bits. Last year in about August time I managed to get to see a specialist in bipolar disorder. After taking many factors into account about my illness and symptoms, he gave me the bad news. To give you the edited highlights, it went basically like this. Mr. Faulkner, I expect you in the next few months to try and take your own life. We can help you, but only if you let us. You must tell us when the time gets close. The problem with psychosis is, I say again, that your brain stops working properly. You don't know what's real, so you make bad decisions. If the psychosis comes on slowly, you might not notice it happening, you might not realize that your brain has stopped working properly. I will try and give you an example that hopefully you can relate to. If you sat in a windowless room with one light bulb and every time you blinked the light bulb got 0.1% dimmer, you would never notice it happening, but before too long would be sitting in all alone in total darkness. No one saw the Colorado carve through the land, but everyone can witness the resulting canyon. When you do start to feel a bit strange, a bit down, a bit depressed, you do what any normal person would do. You try and make yourself happy. Sadly, you're depressed, so socializing is hard. Firstly, you don't feel like it, and secondly, you're not much fun anyway. So you think about the times in your life you were happy. Really happy. When was it? It was when you were younger and going out with your friends to all the pubs and clubs. The drinking, the dancing, the drugs. The endless parties. A weekend wasted was never wasted weekend. Then it hits you. I should have a beer or two. That always cheers me up. And this is where it starts, self-medication. The psychosis has started and you have begun using psychoactive substances to control the effects. It's just a beer or two to start with, but alcohol won't solve the problem, it won't cure the depression, it only masks it temporarily. And as with all drugs, you have the law of diminishing returns. You always need more, you always need something stronger. What started as a beer because you felt a bit down one day, soon turns into trying to find anything to block out the darkness. To borrow a line from Shakespeare. Something wicked this way comes. Addiction. Should you have gone to a doctor, the doctor that told you that you would try and take your own life? Yes, obviously yes. But that's not how psychosis works. The addiction grows stronger, the depression grows deeper, and you realize that you have lost control again. Trying to take your own life can take many forms. Some attempts are over in a fraction of a second, like jumping off a cliff, or driving your car into a motorway bridge. Some attempts take a minute or two, like slitting your wrists. Some attempts take a day or two, like an overdose of paracetamol. And some attempts take months, like addiction brought on by psychosis. Imagine your brain going wrong every couple of years or so, for your whole adult life. Imagine never being sure if what you're thinking was right, or even if things you were seeing or hearing were real. Then imagine your memory starting to go, and you can't remember with certainty what you did this morning. How confusing would you find the world? Would you self-medicate? Would you drink? Could you stay clear of addiction and relapse? Now imagine all of that, and the warning from a specialist that this time round, this cycle would be the worst in your life. Then imagine it happening. Imagine it happening as COVID started. Imagine being in lockdown as the world was gripped with existential dread, and your brain stops working as well. Imagine not even being able to go and see your family for support because of coronavirus. Imagine being turned away from the hospital because of the pandemic. Would you self-medicate? Would you drink? Could you stay clear of addiction and relapse? The biggest problem with depression is that it makes you feel alone. The often used quote is that depression is the feeling of loneliness in a crowded room. This is 100% correct. Humans need to make connections, ideally to people, but if psychosis or depression strike, and they are unable to make connections to people, they will make connections with things. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, pornography, computer games, the internet, are just some of the more common ones. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's connections. Human connections. It's love. We owe to American psychologist, Dr. Bruce Alexander, the understanding that addiction is about far more than any drug. That a person, or animal in his studies, is an active ingredient in their interaction with a drug. For anyone to have a chance at beating addiction, they would, I believe, be far better equipped if they followed his lead. Dr. Alexander's experiments, in the 1970s, have come to be called the rat park. Researchers had already proved that when rats were placed in a cage, all alone, with no other community of rats, and offered 2 water bottles, one filled with water and the other with water mixed with heroin or cocaine, the rats would repetitively drink from the drug-laced bottles until they all overdosed and died. Like pigeons pressing a pleasure lever, they were relentless, until their bodies and brains were overcome, and they passed away. Dr. Alexander wondered if this was about the drug or might it be related to the setting they were in. To test his hypothesis, he put rats in rat parks, where they were among others and free to roam and play, to socialize, and to have sex. And they were given the same access to the same 2 types of drug-laced bottles. When inhabiting a rat park, they remarkably preferred the plain water. Even when they did imbibe from the drug-filled bottle, they did so intermittently, not obsessively, and never overdosed. A social community beat the power of drugs. I believe that the biggest problem with the powerful, ubiquitous psychoactive drugs, meaning those that work on our brains and minds, is that they are so effective. In immediate and powerful ways, they change how we feel, think, relate, and behave. Or transport us away from loneliness and isolation. That is why we use them. It is also why campaigns of just saying no are ineffective, and why the dilemma of drug taking, legal and illicit, has become one of the most dominant societal dilemmas we face in the 21st century. What we can do, a needed and effective approach, derived from what has Dr. Alexander taught us. Humans, not just rats, need to be part of a community, encouraged to relate and experience the support of others. This is about as basic a psychological truth as exists. People need people. The stereotype of the lonely crazy cat lady exists for a reason. Of the many years of treatment and therapy, only one therapist has talked to me about sources of human contact and support. Shout out to UFG. Okay, so, we know this works in rats, but does it work in humans? Now obviously this is an experiment you could never do in real life. You could never take a significant amount of people, put them somewhere horrible, get them addicted to drugs and then try to get them clean with just love. Only the experiment has been done. It was the Vietnam War. Despite what most people think, for most people addiction is situational and of limited duration. In some cases, such as people in war zones, the situational nature of addiction is so obvious that everyone has noted it. Richard Wilbur, a physician who was the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health and Environment from 1971 to 1973, said of this phenomenon, "Everything I learned in medical school about addiction, that someone addicted to narcotics remained hooked forever, was proved wrong." In fact, over 90% of the returned vets who had been addicted to heroin in Asia ceased being addicted in the States virtually at once. The Vietnam addiction experience was catalogued by Lee Robbins, a professor of social science in psychiatry at Washington University in St. Louis, and her colleagues in the 1977 classic, Vietnam Veterans 3 Years After Vietnam, How Our Study Changed Our View of Heroin. It is the most careful and detailed study of a group of hundreds of heroin-addicted people ever conducted. Everything Robbins and her colleagues took on faith about heroin was disproved. Most soldiers, 85%, said they found opioids readily available to them at home, so we can discount the idea of lack of supply accounting for their mass recovery. Half did try the drugs again in the States. But even among the most vulnerable group, the previously addicted soldiers who used heroin again stateside, fewer than a third ever became re-addicted. In other words, non-addicted use of opioids was not only possible for formerly addicted soldiers, but more likely than not under their radically transformed circumstances. To make it clear, when the men got home from the war, when the men had hope, when the men had love, and when the men had connections, they didn't need the connection to the heroin. Do we ask questions like, who do you care about in your life? Who cares about you? When was the last time you spent time with people who are good for you, instead of those who hurt you and foster your drug taking? These questions may lead to others, such as, who can you spend time with in the next couple of days? What gives you pause in calling or making the kind of human contact needed to enable recovery? What do you imagine these people would think and feel if you did make contact? How might that encounter go, where it was not about asking for help or money, but instead simply, and most importantly, about reigniting their friendship, their attachment to you, and their wish for your life to go well? Their interest is one way to achieve the dignity, purpose, meaning, and life of contribution so critical to the hard work of recovery. The science of medicine, with the exceptional value it attributes to symptoms, diagnoses, and evidence-based therapies, has had the unintended effect of eclipsing what we know and can do about the benefits of human interaction and attachment. Mother Teresa said, "If you want to change the world, go home and love your family." I think the Beatles said much the same thing. And when we see people and families who are keeping their emotional heads above the waters of everyday life, who are not compulsively imbibing drug-laced concoctions, or pathologically gambling or playing video games and the like, we will see that they lead their lives in the light of relationships, in human parks, not alone. Why did I tell you all of that? Imagine a psychosis so strong it will tell you to kill yourself, then imagine coronavirus lockdown at the same time. Imagine the loneliness. Imagine if your brain did this to you. Imagine if this was your life. Would you self-medicate? Would you drink? Could you stay clear of addiction and relapse? And that, my friends, is why I find myself in hospital again.